Hey guys, so I'm making a series on the history of religious ideas, and I'm beginning here with Mesopotamia. Here is a map that shows where Mesopotamia was situated. Basically runs across present-day Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and it's the area around the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. This area gave birth to one of the oldest, though not necessarily first civilization, that of Sumer. And the religion of Sumer can be centered around two main triads: the triad of the great gods and the triad of the planetary gods. Now, to begin with the triad of the great gods, you had An, Enlil, and Enki. An was the god of the sky. He was sort of a supreme god in this pantheon, and he retains what's called a deus odiosus status. So deus odiosus is Latin for idol god, and there's a very common phenomena in archaic religion where there's a concept of a supreme god, but the supreme god is not involved in human affairs, and he is not worshipped. So An sort of reflects this artifact in the religion of Sumer. After An, there's Enlil, who is the god of the atmosphere, and then we have Enki, who is the god of the earth. Now, there was some misunderstanding about Enki's role by earlier scholarship. They thought that maybe Enki was also the god of primordial waters, but this is not correct. The god, or rather the goddess of primordial waters, is Namu. Now, Namu is the mother who gave birth to the god of the sky and the god of the earth. So she gave birth to An and Enki. Now, when these gods were generated, they were generated in union. They were together. And this union then generated Enlil, who is the god of atmosphere. Enlil then separated his parent gods. He separated the god of the sky and god of the earth, and that's how the world was created, and that's how this triad was formed. Now, the world that was created had a paradise on it called Dilmun. Dilmun was a country that had no illness or death. Everything was perfect. The lions didn't hunt other prey. The wolves didn't carry off lambs. Again, there was no sickness. Everything was perfection. Death was introduced into this world by a mistake made by Enlil. Enlil, lying one day in this paradise with his wife who is Ningursag, after he woke up, he ate some plants who were not yet completely created. Their destiny, or their mode of being, was not set yet, so he consumed them prematurely. When he did this, he really pissed off his goddess wife, Ningursag, and she said that she'll never look at him with the look of life, and that he would therefore die. So this myth introduces death, and you can see some obvious parallels with that of Genesis. Now, when it comes to the creation of man, Sumer had several theories or several myths that explain the creation of man. One was that man sort of sprouted from the ground, almost like a plant. Another one was that man was fashioned out of clay. And then there was also one that man was generated from two immolated gods. Now, man was created for the service of gods. The gods set up this order, this cosmic order that was set by destiny, which man participated in, and this cosmic order was constantly threatened by the great serpent. The great serpent was the one who wanted to reduce everything back to chaos. Again, you see some elements here that might relate to the biblical narrative. Now, one of the primary myths of Sumer was the myth of Inanna and Dumuzi. And this now ties into the second triad. So we spoke of the first triad of the great gods, and now we have the second triad, which is the triad of the planetary gods. And the planets that they centered on were the moon, the sun, and Venus. The moon was Nanasung, the sun was Utu, and Venus was Inanna. Now, in Akkadian, Venus was known as Ishtar. Ishtar is probably the well-known name, and so I will refer to this goddess as Inanna Ishtar. Now, Inanna Ishtar was the goddess of love and war, and so she controlled both life and death. She was depicted as a hermaphrodite. This was a common symbol that represented perfection, wholeness, and completion. She married a shepherd by the name of Dumuzid. Now, Dumuzid would later be known by his alternate name as Tammuz. But the myth goes that Inanna Ishtar, who is now the goddess of the sky, wants to take over the underworld. So we have an invasion, the heavens invading the underworld. And she wants to seize it from her elder sister, who was the queen of the underworld, named Enesh Kugel. Now, this was a very dangerous endeavor because it was a dictate or a maxim in the religion of Sumer that anyone who descended into the underworld could not leave. It's a one-way trip. You get there, you stay there. And so she prepares by clothing herself with many items. These items were ultimately symbols for her obtaining as many powers as she could to prepare herself before her descent. And she told the other gods that she was doing this, and she asked them that if she's not back within 3 days, to rescue her. And so, in the myth, she sets down into the underworld, and there are these 7 gates that she must pass through before she reaches the palace of her enemy. And she passes through the 7 gates, but at each gate, she loses something. She loses a piece of clothing or some portion of attire. And by the time she gets to the palace, she is naked, which also again symbolizes that she is powerless. So she arrives there, and she is punished. The seven judges there, who are the Anunnaki, seize her, and they kill her, and they hang her body on a hook. So there she is, in the underworld, dead. Now, the gods in the heaven realize that she's been missing for 3 days and nights, so they basically negotiate through messengers to release Inanna. The judges agree to release Inanna on the condition that she finds someone to take her place. So this begins a quest of her trying to find someone to take her place. And as she's looking around, there she finds her husband, Dumuzid. While everyone else is sad and lamenting her passing and her disappearance, Dumuzid was sitting on Ishtar's throne, getting entertained by slave girls. Needless to say, Inanna Ishtar was very upset, and she got the demons of the underworld to seize Dumuzid, and he was brought down into hell, where he was tortured and punished. Now, eventually, Inanna Ishtar would feel bad for Dumuzid, and she would ask that he be released. The underworld refused to release him for the whole year. And the underworld refused to release him. And what they decided to do was a compromise, that he would be released for half of the year, and the other half of the year he would have to spend in hell. Now, this myth formed a very popular cult. Now, like I said, Dumuzid was later called Tammuz. There was a cult of Tammuz that spread all over the Middle East, and it centered around the cycle of chaos and order, of life and death, of fertility and infertility. And it's even referenced to in the Bible in Ezekiel 8:14. As we develop the history of Mesopotamia, it was originally these isolated city temples that were dispersed throughout that area. But eventually, some people would be able to unify this region. And you had this cyclic pattern where you would have one king who then unifies the region, but then his dynasty would die out within 100 years, and then another king would come and unify the region, and his dynasty would die out within 100 years. And you had this cycle back and forth, beginning with Lugal Zagas, then you had Sargon of Akkad, Yudguteya, and of course Hammurabi, who's probably the most well-known one. Now, this synthesis of going from a city temple, individual city temples, to the city-state had some important developments. But overall, there was a lot of conservatism. So even though the Sumerian language died out in 2000 BC, the language was retained in a liturgical way. So in religious rites, they still use this language. Likewise, initially, the triad remained. You still had An, Enlil, and E, or Enki. But eventually, there would be some important developments. So Marduk of Babylon would become the supreme being, and the concept and practice of divination was created in this time period. So things like astrology came to being. Now, one of the most important documents or myths of this time, other than the myth of Gilgamesh, was the Enuma Elish, which is translated as "Where on High." It's actually the beginning of this epic myth that really serves as one of the most important documents of this civilization. Now, there's a creation myth there. The creation myth there begins with Tiamat and Apsu. Tiamat is the goddess of the sea. She's the goddess of salty water, while Apsu is the god of fresh water. Apsu and Tiamat join, and they generate many gods. Now, the last god to be generated was Marduk. Now, it creates this, I don't want to say funny, but it creates this interesting situation where Apsu cannot get any rest because the gods keep bothering him, or they keep doing things that disturb him. So he's unable to get any sleep, and he's restless during the day. So he complains to Tiamat that they should annihilate these gods. When this spreads to the gods and they realize that Apsu wants to do this, they kill Apsu. Apsu gets killed, and then Tiamat wants to avenge his death. So she creates all these monsters and demons that become a formidable force, and the gods that were created by them do not want to fight Tiamat. Now, Tiamat's prime god, or the first demon she creates, was Kingu. And Kingu was this terrifying figure that none of the gods wanted to deal with, except one, Marduk. Now, Marduk tells the gods that he will battle Tiamat on condition that if he wins, if he is successful, he becomes the supreme deity. And they all agree. So in the Enuma Elish, there's this scene where Tiamat and Marduk face off. And in the climax, when Tiamat is opening her mouth and she wants to swallow Marduk, Marduk hurls this gust of wind into her mouth, and she basically blows up. All right, she becomes very swollen and large. Marduk takes an arrow, shoots it into her belly. Her belly gets blown open, her entrails spill out, and he pierces her heart, and she dies. He steps on her body, and he declares victory. He then cuts her skull and body in half. The lower part of her body becomes the earth, and the other part becomes the sky. And therein we have the creation of the world from a dead god. Now, he then takes Kingu, who was this horrific monster that Tiamat created, and he slits his wrists, unleashing his blood. And from that blood, humans were generated. So think about that. Literally, humans originated from a demon, according to the Babylonian religious system. Quite a pessimistic worldview, is it not? Now, this myth inspired a very interesting ritual. The ritual was called Zagmuk, and it was celebrated on the 4th day of the new year. The king of Babylon, during this ritual, would be ceremonially stripped naked. He would then be slapped by the high priest, and this was a symbol of humiliation that reflected Marduk's captivity. And there was this process wherein they would basically, the king would pray to the gods, particularly to Marduk, and he would ask for forgiveness, and the high priest would reassure him that Marduk will forgive him. So overall, the Mesopotamian system was it's a very interesting system. It's highly pessimistic based on some of these things that you've read. But I just want to end with this one prayer. It's actually quite a beautiful prayer that originated out of Babylon. And it goes like this. O Lord, great are my sins. O God, whom I do not know, great are my sins. O Goddess, whom I do not know, great are my sins. Man knows nothing, whether he is committing sin or doing good. He does not even know. O my Lord, do not cast thy servant down. My transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions.